Hello, this is Mr. Smith with the daily participation video. If you would click on resubmit, the text box will open up and you can type 3 significant things from today's lesson. And we just want to finish up by talking about some of the alternative types of business organizations. We talked about sole proprietorships, we talked about partnerships, we talked about corporations. So let's talk about the other types that can exist: LLCs, LLPs, S Corps, and C Corps. And also we'll finish up by talking about franchises. C Corp we've already talked about. This whenever we talk about corporations, or if you look in a basic high school economics textbook, it's talking about corporations. It's referring to C Corps. So S Corps are a specific subchapter that we'll talk about here today briefly. So let's look at the LLP first, and that's a limited liability partnership. Now, it's important to remember that when it comes to business law, that is not in the Constitution. So according to Amendment 10, it's left up to the states. Each of the states have different ways of regulating or structuring, organizing, defining each of these types of organizations. Some of them might not even exist in each state, for instance, or they have different rules and regulations and so on. So I'm just talking about this in general. And in Pennsylvania, of course, these can all exist as business organizations. So LLPs, one important thing to remember about limited liability partnership is that it is only for certain professions. So careers that have a license that goes with a particular type of job description or get permission from the state to form it. So doctors, for instance, would be an example. And there are also often special insurance requirements that go along with it because of that. The partners are liable only for their own decisions, but not for their partners because of these legal and insurance requirements. So someone who sets up an LLP, they do this because they still want it to be a simple business. It is less complicated and it doesn't involve the paperwork and taxes to the level of an LLC or an S Corp or a C Corp or anything like that. And it still has the simplicity of a partnership, but it does have that limited liability protection that these have. And so that's one of the benefits of having a limited liability partnership. So some states only allow certain professionals, for instance, to have the LLPs. You still have to have official documents and usually some kind of state filing fee. They're really similar to the LLC, but they're just a little bit different. The partners enjoy limited liability. There's protection of certain limitations on a partner's personal assets, for instance, so they're not going to be personally liable as much as with a sole proprietorship, for instance. Partners are not liable for the neglect or wrongful acts of others, and that limited amount of paperwork is what makes this more beneficial than the other ones that are on the screen there. And they themselves are not taxed, the business itself. So in that way, it's also similar to a regular partnership in that they're split up the profits based on their agreement, and then they pay those profit taxes as part of their own income. So that would be an LLP. And so you might wonder, what is the difference between an LLP and an LLC? Well, an LLC, limited liability company, is someone who wants limited liability just like a corporation without all of the big structure and administration and more cumbersome ongoing requirements that go along with it. So they want it to be simpler than a corporation itself. And the LLC has a lot of flexibility and simplicity that the S Corp and the C Corps don't have. So you still need to file paperwork and obviously fees with the state government. You do have limited liability. So LLC members is what they're called, not stockholders. Members and managers enjoy the same limited liability that shareholders in a corporation would enjoy. And it protects their personal assets, so they don't have to worry about their belongings and personal finances getting involved if the company does something wrong, for instance. They can be taxed as a corporation if they choose to be, or they can choose to pass the money that would be taxed basically through a structure similar to that of one of the other types of businesses that exist. That gets a little bit more complicated. They can be divided, the members, the owners, can be divided into many classes as they want to, with certain rights, for instance, and how they divide up the profits and losses and responsibilities. That's really up to them, so they have that freedom as well. An LLC, though, can change its number of members, and it can have one, for instance, as opposed to an LLP, which is a partnership. So the LLP actually has to have multiple owners. Being that the LLC can change how it funnels its taxes through, it can choose to be taxed like a sole proprietorship or a partnership or whatever. And since it has that little bit of a flexibility, if that's what's important, limited liability and flexibility, then an LLC might be the best manner to choose. If you're wanting a more locked-in type of agreement, then of course an LLP is going to be what you want to go with, since that is like basically a partnership. And it has some of the same pros and cons as a general partnership would. And the last one of these, the four that I will describe, because we're only going to look at the three since we already looked at regular corporations or C Corps. We'll look at S Corps. And so these subchapter corporations are simply basically like a corporation. They have the limited liability. They have the formal structure of a corporation. But like the LLC, you can pass through the money, the pass-through taxation that can occur with your business profits. So the money doesn't get taxed separately as a corporation like it would with a C Corp. Remember, a C Corp, they have to pay corporate taxes, and then if they share profits with the owners, the shareholders, they also have to pay taxes on the dividends. But with an S Corp, they don't do that. They don't pay corporate taxes. The money comes back to the shareholders, and they pay taxes themselves. So it is recognized in a number of states, including Pennsylvania, and has many of the rights, just the same as a C Corp, as an individual person. So an S Corp has that individual entity type of existence. Now, the S Corps can be limited in what type of activities they're allowed to be involved with. They have some of the same drawbacks as corporations. They can be more complex. And the S Corps are limited to the number of shareholders. For instance, in Pennsylvania, you can only have 100. So you can sell stock like a regular corporation to make money, but you can only do it up to having 100 shareholders. Also, the S Corp, you only have just shareholders, and that's it. They have the same rights. In a corporation, you can classify different types of shareholders. Maybe some get their money first, but they don't get to vote for the board of directors, or they have limited vote, or whatever the explanation can be. The C Corps can change so that the owners can fall into all kinds of different categories. But in S Corp, it can only be up to 100, and they all have to have the same type of rights as each other. And then, of course, with an S Corp, the shareholders that are actually working and managing the business are also counted as employees. So an S Corp has a lot of the benefits as a corporation, but it's not as complex. It can't be as big. And so basically with each of these, it's really about the liability and the taxation. Those are the key variables. The last one I want to mention is the franchise. And a franchise is kind of an oddity because you can be a franchise and the different parts to it can actually be different types of business organizations. So usually you have some kind of larger institution, franchise that wants to expand its operation but doesn't want to be involved with the smaller components. So you have some kind of mother organization, a franchisor, which can be, I've seen it spelled with both ER or R, but this franchisor can basically just have the advertising, the headquarters, the original investment of setting up the company, the creation of the products, and so on. And then it will ask investors spread throughout the country to open up their own little shops and become franchisees. And each of these franchisees will stock whatever product this franchisor creates and advertises, and they will sell it locally. And so that means the franchisor doesn't have to be involved in all these different parts of the country. They don't have to set up each of these locations. They don't have to come up with funding for each of these buildings. And so that's the benefit for the franchisor. For the franchisee, they don't have to come up with the advertising. They don't have to come up with the product. They might not even have to come up with the type of store, because maybe designs are already standardized and they have to make it this way. And so the benefit for them is they don't have to come up with all that, and they're part of a brand name. However, at the same time, they obviously have to pay a fee in order to get the rights to have this, or they might have to buy a certain amount of stock or inventory, so for instance, maybe if you you're a franchisee for a certain company that sells chainsaws, you might have to buy, $30, $40, $50,000 worth of equipment to keep on your shelves before you're officially allowed to open up. Or maybe you're a franchisee that sells ATVs or some other type of leisurely vehicles, and you might have to buy $100,000 worth of equipment to put on the floor before you're allowed to officially open up as a franchisee. So I guess the point of that is, the con is that it's expensive to start up and you don't have a lot of control. A lot of what this franchisor says you have to do. And the con for the franchisor is that you can't control what each of these individuals does. This franchisee in northwestern Pennsylvania might have some pretty crazy ideas and opinions that they don't keep themselves, that they express within their little shop. And so the franchisor will have to put out statements. They're not an official employee of ours. This is their own little separate business. And they might eventually have to be forced to the point where they have to disconnect from them, and they won't be allowed to use the same name and products and so on. So that can be a problem for the franchisor, is that they are keeping a lot of tight control over all these places, but at the same time, they don't have complete control like they would if it was completely their company. And earlier, when I started talking about franchises, I mentioned that they can be different types of business organizations. So, this guy owns his own franchise. It could be set up as a sole proprietorship, where the franchisor is probably set up as a corporation. Not all the time, but probably. But if you want to, maybe you and a group of investors goes into just setting up one of these, you could also set it up as a corporation, but it would be a separate corporation. So you might see them take on any one of these types, or one of the earlier ones that we talked about yesterday or the day before or whatever. And so you could have different kinds of business organizations within a franchise. So these are all just some of the types of setups. Obviously, it involves legality. There are companies that sometimes are law firms or other types of businesses that's all they do, is they advise people what type of business set up, and they help with the paperwork, and they help them process the fees. Obviously, they charge for that. But there are companies, businesses that specialize in helping to set up other businesses. And it's easy to find a lot of this information on the internet. Some of the simpler forms of businesses, you can just go onto a website, and for a low cost or maybe nothing at all, just researching the information yourself, learn how to set it up.